While I get situated here, just let me make sure the sound is right. Everything's okay? You can hear me well? Okay. Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Mike. Thank you to Mike and Thomas for inviting me to be here. I wish my head were a well of water and my eyes fountains of tears, so I could weep day and night for the slain among my dear, dear people. You may recognize that from the prayer of the weeping prophet Jeremiah, recorded in Jeremiah 1:9. It was also the first line of an email I received from last week from a friend in Bethlehem, a pastor's wife. Now, like many of you, I'm sure I've been overwhelmed by sadness and helplessness as I listened to reports from Gaza and from Israel. And at one point last week, because I just had to do something, I started writing notes, brief words of concern and prayers to friends in the West Bank and Israel. I don't expect you to write back in the middle of all this chaos, I wrote, but if you do, I will cherish your words. And so my dear friend Salwa from Bethlehem wrote back, starting with those words from Jeremiah. She continued, "Yes, dear Lynne, by the grace of God, as a family and as a church, we are okay. But our hearts are grieving constantly. We cannot weep enough for whole families being killed, women becoming widows, mothers collecting the parts of their children's bodies, and innocent babies being burned and torn to pieces. We are always tense, waiting for calls from friends in Gaza who are like the living dead. No electricity, no money, no food. They left their souls and their hearts at the homes they were forced to leave, not knowing whether they would be the next targets for the rockets that don't differentiate between men or women, grown-ups or babies. We pray for this killing to come to an end. Lord God, have mercy on your people." Salwa ends with a question. So how, my friend, can a normal human being put his or her head peacefully on the pillow and go to sleep? How indeed. I also received return notes from some of my friends in Israel. One young Jewish woman who I met through her work on Arab rights in Israel wrote this: "I fear every moment for my friends and family living in the line of the rocket fire from Hamas. And then I grieve every moment for the horrific loss of life in Gaza." Another Israeli Jewish woman, a follower of Jesus and a poet, sent me these lines from a poem she had just written. "War's cost is paid incrementally, drop by crimson drop, tear by tear rent from ruptured hearts. The young, the old, all bleed red on never satiated earth. All bleed red on never satiated earth." I've been vacationing with my family, so I've tried not to be obsessed with what's been happening in the Holy Land, but I've not been very successful. Last week, my 2-year-old grandson was being his usual exuberant self, which led to a serious impact between his forehead and a hardwood floor, and then to a bone-deep gash and 9 stitches in his perfect little face. Well, I sat like any grandmother in the emergency room, snuggling her grandbaby, willing him with heart and soul to be whole and healthy again. But a part of my mind was elsewhere, thinking of a grandmother in Gaza, holding her broken baby. 9 stitches, and my little Mac was as good as new. But there are not enough stitches in the world to fix the babies of Gaza. Well, I know we all have to get on with our real lives. I think a little obsession on behalf of Gaza is in order. And certainly a lot of prayer is in order. And if you're like me, you may not know how to pray for the Holy Land right now, and you may not be able to find any words that seem appropriate, as our brother led us earlier. But we can all weep with Jeremiah, and we can all name one by one the people we know who live there, and hold them lovingly in the presence of God's Spirit. And if you don't know anyone who lives there, you will by the end of this conference, and I implore you to pray for them. The first time I gave a formal talk focused on the Holy Land was in the spring of 2010, when I spoke at a conference hosted by Bethlehem Bible College. It was called Christ at the Checkpoint. I gave a talk called It's All About Jesus, A Personal Journey. And I chose that title because my engagement in the Holy Land was a very personal attempt to follow in the way of Jesus. I had spent considerable time in the region and was brokenhearted by the suffering that resulted from the ongoing conflict that was often violent. And I believed that what Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs needed most was to see Jesus incarnated in his followers in the Holy Land. And so I went to Christ at the Checkpoint with the desire to encourage and lift up the Christians in the land and to stand in solidarity with them. Now, I had learned by that time that this issue can be theologically very controversial. I knew that some Christians make a strong case that the birth of the modern state of Israel in 1948 and the ingathering of the Jews to the Holy Land is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies that are tied to end-time events and to the second coming of Christ. I knew that other Christians emphasize Jesus' fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, and they emphasize the spiritual nature of God's kingdom that is not connected to a physical place. And I knew that Jewish followers of Jesus, Messianic Jews, tended to fall more in that first theological camp that I just described, and that Palestinian Christians tend to fall in the latter camp. So I knew that difference in theologies, and I tried to be sensitive to that, but I was still caught off guard after my talk when a Messianic Jewish theologian from Israel told me that he believed I had totally violated Scripture by talking about the plight of the Palestinians. He reminded me that God had given the land to the Jews, and if the Palestinians were suffering, it was because God's will regarding the land was being violated. And if I thought the treatment they were receiving was unjust, it was because I just didn't understand God's purpose in the world. Well, that was a very awkward and disturbing conversation. Now fast forward 2 years. In 2012, I spoke at the second Christ at the Checkpoint conference. And again, that same Messianic theologian approached me afterwards, and I assumed that we would have another awkward conversation. But instead, he said, "Thank you for that talk. That was a great talk. In fact, I think you should give that talk to some of our Jewish congregations." Now, what happened during the 2 years between those two conversations? Well, what happened in me is that a very wise friend, actually a Palestinian Christian, challenged me to spend as much time with Israelis as I had been spending with Palestinians, and so I began doing that. In subsequent trips, I met with secular mainstream Jews. I met with people in the Israeli peace movement. I ate Shabbat meals with Orthodox families. I talked with Israeli families who had lost children to the violence of suicide bombers. I listened to the perspective of Messianic Jews. Perhaps most significantly, I walked slowly through the halls of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. And in my second talk in Bethlehem, I described all of those experiences. I also said, I will never bring a group of people to visit Israel and Palestine again without taking them to Yad Vashem. How can we begin to understand this place without holding the reality of Jewish history in our conscious awareness? So my heart had been broken on a deeper level for the Jewish people, and that came through in my talk, and that mattered to the Jewish theologian. But what also happened during those 2 years was that the Jewish theologian spent time with Palestinians in the West Bank, and he actually saw the reality of their daily lives. And he said to me, "I still support the state of Israel and believe the Jews have a unique role to play in God's redemptive plan. But the kind of injustice I've seen in the West Bank and that you have described in your talks is unconscionable. It can't continue." Well, that story of those two very different conversations has been very encouraging to me. And I've been similarly encouraged by many people with whom I disagree on some points of theology, but for whom I have the deepest respect and whose level of compassion and wisdom humbles me. Honestly, I've been blessed by gracious mentors from many different perspectives, and I'm very thankful for them. On the other hand, during the last couple of years, despite encouraging encounters, I've been greatly discouraged by the increasing number of blogs and articles and emails written about or to me that question not only my theology, but my motives, my calling, and my intelligence. In a variety of ways, I've been called a threat to the state of Israel and an anti-Semite. I've been described as part of a massive effort in the heart of the evangelical church to lure its members, especially its youth, away from the pro-Israel position that God commands to an uncritical and unbiblical support for Palestinians. Now, I'm not new to the world of criticism. 40 years ago, my husband and I started a church in a movie theater, and we used drums and guitars in worship. Says it all. We were immediately, literally, denounced by the evangelical establishment that called us a cult and warned its young people to stay away from us. And since then, we've taken plenty of other actions that many people have deemed worthy of criticism, from using women in leadership to advocating for immigration reform, and there have been plenty of other things. But generally, we don't respond to our critics unless they approach us personally. But last December, I felt that I needed to respond to my critics about Israel and Palestine. Too many people were quoting me out of context or making assumptions about what they thought I believed. And so I ended up writing a paper called 6 Things I Believe About the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And I presented it at a gathering of Palestinian Christians, Israeli Messianic Jews, and American Christians from a variety of perspectives. Now, I'm going to present those 6 statements again this morning because I still believe that they're true, and I think they will provide a foundation for the rest of this conference. This talk does assume that you have a pretty good knowledge of the history of this conflict, but I do think that's true about you, so I think I can make that assumption. And if you don't, I know that there will be other people throughout the conference who will fill in parts of the history and reality. And I do want to clarify that in this particular case, I'm not speaking on behalf of my husband, and my church, or any other organization I might be associated with. I'm not saying that they don't agree with me, I'm just not claiming that they do. I am speaking strictly as an individual. So the first statement I want to make is this: I believe it is possible to be truly pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian at the same time. On my first meaningful trip to the region, both Israeli and Palestinian leaders says this is not a zero-sum conflict. In the Holy Land, nobody wins unless everybody wins. Either Israelis and Palestinians learn to live together, or we will die together. So if you're here to pick sides, go away. We do not need that kind of help. But if you're willing to figure out how to be a common friend to both Israelis and Palestinians, then we welcome you. We welcome your help. And with each trip I make to the region, my commitment to that perspective grows. Now, when I say that I'm pro-Israel, I mean that I support the existence of the state of Israel as a home for the Jewish people. And I long for the day when Jews can live there without the fear of rockets from Gaza or suicide bombers or any other kind of violence against them. In a world in which anti-Semitism is tragically still alive and well, I am thankful for the state of Israel. The fact that I may disagree with some policies of the Israeli government does not mean that I'm anti-Israel or anti-Jew, any more than my disagreement with certain policies of the US government means that I'm anti-US or anti-American. When I say that I'm pro-Palestinian, I mean that I believe Palestinians have an equally valid right to live in the land and should have the same civil rights that are afforded to Israeli Jewish citizens, whether that's in 1 state, 2 states, or however many states. I believe Palestinians, whether they're in the West Bank or in Gaza, should be free from military occupation and blockade. They should be able to travel freely between their own communities, engage in commerce, and have easy access to the outside world, the same way we all do. My second statement is this: I believe that if we want to engage in the Holy Land as peacemakers, we must recognize that Israelis and Palestinians have very different and often conflicting histories and narratives, each of which must be sought out and respectfully heard. Now, I have been accused of trading the true Jewish narrative for a false Palestinian narrative, and I have to say, I just don't understand that accusation. How could two groups of people on opposite sides of a violent conflict not have different experiences of what happened and different memories? And when you pay attention to both narratives, it's easy to understand why the Jews want a homeland in that little strip of land where they have biblical and historical ties. And it's easy to understand why the Palestinians feel they have an equally valid claim on that land based on centuries of residence there. Certainly, either narrative can be mythologized and distorted and used to demonize the other, so part of the task for people seeking peace is to listen with a discerning ear, to study well, to question what we hear, and to learn from a wide variety of people. About a year ago in Bethlehem, I had just such an opportunity. I attended a meeting of Palestinian women, both Christians and Muslims, and there were two speakers at the meeting. One was an Israeli Messianic Jew from Nazareth. The other was a Palestinian Christian woman from Jerusalem. And each of these women, in turn, described the typical narrative that is commonly held by her people, and then she critiqued it. The Jewish woman said, "You won't like what I'm going to say, but this is what most Jews believe. They believe that Jewish violence in the War of 1948 was purely defensive. Jews were simply defending themselves against Arab aggressors. But before you get mad at me, I need to tell you that I realize that is not true. The tragic truth is that in 1948, many Arabs were aggressively forced from their land and/or brutally killed by Jewish fighters." She said, "Admitting this makes me pretty unpopular with some Israelis, but we must be open to self-criticism." The Palestinian woman described some of the hardships of the occupation, but then she said, "We Palestinians tend to think that all of our problems are caused by the occupation." But that's not true. She said, "We must accept culpability for allowing a victim mentality to dominate our actions and for making many poor choices along the way that have hurt us collectively." Now, that was hard for some of the Palestinian women to hear, and they discussed it at length. But at the end of the meeting, they asked to meet again because they wanted to continue the discussions. It was such a privilege for me to be able to sit in on that meeting. How admirable, how wise, and how courageous for these women to be willing to listen to the narrative of the other and also to critique their own. I believe that women like that, doing that, are laying a foundation for peace and modeling that for all of us. Number 3, I believe biblical theology leaves room for Jews and Arabs to live together as neighbors and equals in the land. I am not a theologian, but I deeply appreciate a book written by two brilliant theologians who I am privileged to know. Salim Munayer is a Palestinian Christian theologian, and Lisa Loden is an Israeli Messianic Jewish theologian. And together they edited a book called The Land Cries Out, which includes essays by a wide variety of Messianic Jews and Palestinian Christians who present very divergent theologies of the land. But what makes this book unique is that because most of the writers actually live in the land and deal with the complexity of reality, they speak with the careful, nuanced voices that complexity requires. And running throughout all the chapters of the book is an image of Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, living together in the land of peace. And some of the writers see a measure of peace achievable through a political solution. Others envision peace only in a distant day when Jesus' kingdom is here in fullness. but they are united in their desire and their commitment to see Jews and Arabs living peacefully and equally as brothers and sisters. Now, I know that the vision of peaceful coexistence and fellowship between Palestinian and Israeli followers of Jesus is strained right now. I'm in contact with enough people to realize that that is true and to hear the way that breaks their hearts. So I don't make this point lightly. On the contrary, I make it humbly and prayerfully. Followers of Jesus in the Holy Land have to struggle with a very difficult blend of theology and politics and history, and all bound together with fear and hurt and repeated disappointments. And so I wanted to commend those of you here who are Palestinian Christians, as well as your Jewish counterparts in Israel, for your ongoing pursuit of relationships in a very difficult situation. I admire you greatly. I commend you for that. Number 4, I believe that the ongoing military occupation of the West Bank and the continuing blockade of Gaza is a violation of human rights. As such, it deeply harms the security, freedom, and dignity of both Palestinians and Israelis. The very fact that I just used the word occupation has led some people to judge me as an enemy of the state of Israel. They have told me that the only occupation is the one perpetrated by the Arabs who are occupying the land of Judea and Samaria that belongs to the Jews. Now, I won't try to argue with the religious logic behind that, but I will say that I know many Israeli Jews who believe that the occupation is wrong, that it violates their Judaic ethic, that it breeds hostility and undermines security, and that it has to end. Recently, I read an op-ed by an Israeli journalist, actually an American Jew, who moved to Israel as an adult because she loves the country of Israel and wants to live there. But she wrote this: "Why can't pro-Israel mean anti-occupation, support for human rights, and equality and democracy for all people under Israel's control? Why should we perpetuate the conflict by supporting Israeli government policies that perpetuate the conflict?" She suggests, in fact, that that's about as anti-Israel as you can get. Now, some of my critics say that people who talk like that woman are left-wing radicals that we as Christians should not be aligning ourselves with, or they're self-hating Jews who should be silenced. I can only say that I've met some so-called left-wing radicals who seem to be wise and compassionate people, and who, in their own words, are Israeli patriots who are fighting for the soul, security, integrity, and future of their country. They just don't want to do that at the expense of Palestinians. And I respect those people, and I think their voices ought to be heard in America. They're not heard here, but I think they should be. Number 5, I believe that any violence against civilians, whether carried out militarily or through guerrilla tactics, is illegal under international law, damages prospects for peace, and should be stopped immediately. I wrote that sentence last December, not even remotely imagining the kind of violence that we would be seeing this summer. I want to be clear that I have never condoned the violence of Hamas, and of course I don't now. But grieving the death of innocent Palestinian civilians in Gaza does not equal support for Hamas. Likewise, grieving the deaths of Israelis and being empathetic to the sense of terror created by continual rocket fire does not equal support for all Israeli policies. I know that there is currently an unprecedented level of hatred rising to the surface among both Palestinians and Israelis. I've heard that from lots of people on the ground. However, I truly do not believe that violent resistance reflects the heart of the majority of Palestinians. And I really do not believe that the level of violence manifested by the Israeli military truly reflects the heart of the majority of Israelis. I may be wrong, But I went to the Holy Land 5 years ago specifically in search of the peacemakers, in search of those who are committed to nonviolence, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And I found them in both Palestine and Israel. And from what I can tell, they're still there, and I'm still committed to partnering with them. Interestingly, those voices of peace have come from a variety of directions. While I believe Jesus is the Prince of Peace whose power will ultimately unleash the deepest level of peace, I have met many Muslims and Jews who may or may not give any conscious consideration to Jesus, but who seem to be living out Jesus' ethic of peacemaking. In fact, in many cases, they have challenged me to take the way of Jesus more seriously. And as I get to know them and become friends with them, I pray that the gentle community we create would become a space in which Jesus can do his best work of healing, redeeming, and transforming each of us in the ways that we most need. Number 6. Obviously, there is a crucial need for political change in the Holy Land. However long a ceasefire is achieved, it will be nothing more than a temporary ceasefire unless major changes are made related to human rights and security and freedom. That's obviously true. However, I believe that our deepest work for peace is not dependent on what happens in the high levels of human power. Not because what happens there is not important, but because what happens on the grassroots level of relationships is even more important. And we, as individual Christians or small communities of faith, are positioned perfectly to make a difference there as we build little enclaves of peaceful relationships from which peace can bubble up. Several months ago, 30 American, Israeli, and Palestinian women met for 2 days in Washington, D.C. We were Christians, Muslims, and Jews, religious and secular, youngish and oldish, but we're all united by our commitment to human rights in the Holy Land. That's what drew us together. Now, some of the Palestinian women had been criticized by their friends in the West Bank for attending a meeting with Israelis, their oppressors. And some of the Israeli women had been criticized by their friends for attending a meeting with Palestinians, their enemies. And some of the American women showed up at the meeting licking wounds sustained from journalists who wrongly judged our character and our motives. So there was a rather high degree of emotional rawness in the gathering. And while that rawness could have pushed us all to put up protective barriers, it actually had the opposite impact. There was an unusual level of honest communication and vulnerability, with Israeli and Palestinian women talking about the fears that they have for their children and the loneliness that they often feel as women committed to peace and reconciliation. There was a particularly profound connection between a young Palestinian woman and an older Israeli woman. They were both psychologists, highly educated and articulate, but neither could quite contain their emotion as they spoke. The young Palestinian woman described what it was like to send her teenage son through a checkpoint, knowing that he would feel frustrated and humiliated. She feared that the humiliation, repeated over and over again, would turn him into an angry young man, maybe even a violent young man. So she tried to keep him away from checkpoints, but she couldn't keep him locked in one little neighborhood. So she feared for his future. The older Israeli woman described what it was like knowing that her teenage grandson was an IDF soldier, standing at a checkpoint with a gun in his hand, terrified of using the power of that weapon, and yet terrified not to. She didn't want him to become the oppressor, but he was, and she feared what that would do to him inside. The two women agreed, we are both victims of this conflict, this occupation, and this ongoing tragedy. We are both victims of the fear that sets our people against each other. But then the Israeli woman spoke out of the wisdom of her years. But look at us here, she said, in this room. Today we are talking about our fear, and instead of fear driving us apart, it has brought us together. We need to keep talking with one another deeply and honestly. We need to use this fear to draw us together. I have to tell you, there was some kind of magic in that room. And I have nothing against men, truly I don't, but I'm not sure that magic would have been felt in a room full of men. Seriously, I think you know this. Women have a great potential for established healing relationships and advocating for human rights in a profoundly personal and captivating way. And actually, I have concluded that probably the most valuable thing that I can do for the cause of peace is to create more and more connections between Palestinian, Israeli, and American women, which really is my goal and my focus for the future. Sorry. I have one final thought about this conflict that I want to leave with you, and I'm turning my 6 statements into 7 today. But before I do that, I just want to make 2 practical statements, 2 practical suggestions. One, I've traveled to Israel, Palestine at least 10 times in the last few years, taking 60 of the highest level staff and leaders from my church, taking them there to learn about the current situation from the people who live there, from Israelis and Palestinians, from people of different faiths or no faith, from people of different political persuasions, from some people who discouraged us and others who continue to inspire us. But all of them were key to our education. If you haven't seen the Holy Land through the eyes of those who live there, please do that. Don't just take a tour of the holy sites, and don't just get all excited about where Jesus walked 2,000 years ago. See today's reality, learn from many people, and then prayerfully discern where you think Jesus is walking and working today in the Holy Land. So that's my first suggestion. Please go and see. Secondly, read and study. If we care about Israel-Palestine, we have to do more than dabble. We need to stretch our minds. I will say I've been involved in many parts of the world. My passion has always been global. It's always been for troubled areas of the world, but nothing has demanded more from me than engaging in Israel-Palestine, both spiritually and just intellectually. I've never had to study so much, and I feel like I have to continually do that. I'd like to recommend a website to you that has a really good resource page. It's called WeBelongToEachOther.org, and that is from a Mother Teresa quote, actually, that says, if we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. And that website is dedicated to the idea that Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians do belong to one another, and we have to work together. So there's a good resource page there, WeBelongToEachOther.org, and go to the resource page. And so those are my 2 practical suggestions. And now here is my last statement of the morning. I believe that peacemaking is the cutting edge of Christian discipleship for the American church in the 21st century. I believe that peacemaking is the cutting edge of Christian discipleship for the American church in the 21st century. And I believe that for 2 reasons. First, the world needs peacemakers. All over this world, people are dying, literally, for lack of peacemakers. And we're called to that. Secondly, American Christians need to be transformed, and nothing requires deeper transformation than peacemaking. For me, the last 5 years have been about being broken over and over again. Broken every time I have to face again how poorly I live out Jesus' call to peacemaking, how quick I am to pick sides and to go for easy answers. Basically, how unlike Jesus I am. The great peacemaker John Paul Lederach wrote a book called Reconcile. And in it, he suggests that the main thing Jesus brought to his role as peacemaker was his presence. He says there was something in Jesus' presence, something in who he was and how he showed up that made the way of peace more likely. I think that something that was in Jesus is what the Holy Land needs now. A friend from Bethlehem who has been engaged in nonviolence and reconciliation for many years wrote this to me last week. He said, when all the dead are buried and the dust settles, a truer and deeper kind of peace needs to rise up from the rubble of the Holy Land. Not a peace that depends on the decisions of politicians or that trips off the tongues of activists, but a peace that bubbles up from the spring of God's love as it fills us and as it pulls us beyond the limits of our own self-interest, as it pulls us to that place where we are free to see and love the other as God does. Unfortunately, I don't think that comes naturally to us. I think it only comes through prayer and silence and disciplined listening to that still, small voice of God. And I just want to say that I am more committed than ever to that journey of transformation. And I know that there are Palestinians and Israelis more committed to that form of transformation than ever before. And I just want to say, would you join us? Would you join me and all the Palestinians and Israelis who are going for that deep transformation that can really lead to peace? If we all do that together, then we can work and strive and pray and sacrifice and encourage one another on toward God's true vision for peace in the Holy Land. Thank you.